we're back with the CHARA Project. I'm Sarah.
And I'm Heather.
Today we're going to study a verse in 1 Timothy 2:9 through 10. You may have heard of this one before. It says, "Women are to dress themselves in modest clothing with decency and good sense, not with elaborate hairstyles, gold, pearls, or expensive apparel, but with good works, as is proper for women who profess to worship God." And Heather, I'm so glad that you chose this verse because I think this is one of those verses that we look at, we go, well, wait a minute, am I supposed to do that today? You know,
yeah, take the jewelry off right now, Sarah. We're
right,
not allowed
right.
to wear that nice hairstyle we both just did this morning.
Right. And so I think the question we ask here is, gosh, is this a cultural truth?
Mm-hmm.
Is it meant for them back then, or is it a timeless truth, meaning it's meant for us today as well? So I believe, and I hope that, Heather, you're going to spend some time explaining that in a minute here.
Yeah, we will.
And letting us know what that is. But in order to study this verse, we are going to apply the CHARA Bible Study Guide, this study method, to this verse. And when we do that, we look at the C stands for context. We look at the text surrounding it. We look at the history. We go back into their culture and try to figure out what's going on. We'll look at the author and their purpose and who wrote it. We'll do some research and look at other outside resources. And then we like to apply it to our lives. So Heather, where do you have us starting today with this verse?
You know, so typically we would normally start with context. I might a little bit, but knowing the history of this passage is really going to help us and come in handy. And so we're going to do something we've never done on this podcast, where the majority of our time is actually going to be spent unwrapping the history of this passage.
Fun. Okay.
And we're going to answer every single one of the history questions in our CHARA guide, the who, what, when, where, why, how. I don't think we've done this yet, and I'm excited about it. But before we go into history, I do want to grab some context. Typically, context helps us see the theme of what's happening around our passage by reading the verses around the verse. But it also, in this case, helps us identify our author, their purpose, the audience. So we get a little bit of a lay of the land, which is going to help us in our history quest today. So let's go to context here before we deep dive into history. I'm not going to read all of it. You know, I'm just going to give you some highlights of what's happening and what's going on. If we go all the way back to 1 Timothy 1, where we're starting at our verses in chapter 2. If we go all the way back to 1, we can start reading the letter from the beginning, because it's not that long of a letter. We should be able to start to read it a little bit.
Well, I'm glad that you mentioned that it's a letter, because one of the things, and we've mentioned this before, but when you're reading an epistle, a letter, you typically want to read the whole thing just like you would today. Yeah. Now, I know we're probably not going to do that today because it would take too long for this podcast. So walk us through it. What are some highlights?
We'll do some highlights. So first, right off chapter 1, verse 1, we get right up front who the author is. It's the Apostle Paul. And then on top of it, right in the next verse, he says who he's writing to, which is Timothy. And he calls him my true son in the faith. And so we start to get a flavor for Paul and what he's going to write about, a little bit of his purpose, a little bit in the way he addresses Timothy, because he says to Timothy, "You're my true son in the faith," which makes me kind of is he nodding to the fact that there are people that aren't in the faith? If he's going to call out that attribute to Timothy?
I love that you noticed that, because that's a little detail that most of us would just read right over.
Right. Well, it's also confirmed for me when you keep on reading, because you get into chapter 1, verse 3 and 4, and he says, "Hey, Timothy, remain in Ephesus so that you may instruct certain people to not teach false doctrine and to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies." It goes on into the chapter talking about, "Hey, Timothy, I'm giving you these instructions so that you will be able to recall them as you fight the good fight." He's basically saying, hey, I'm going to start to give you this instruction because there's some stuff that's going on here that you need to help correct. And the rest of the letter is Paul instructing Timothy on leading the church of Ephesus. And our verse in chapter 2, verses 9 and 10, our verses are in the mix of all that instruction around this false doctrine.
You know, I love it in a letter when you see instruction like that, and you ask, well, what instruction was given? And then you kind of ask the question, well, why? So obviously there is, and you mentioned that right in the beginning of 1 Timothy 2, that there was false teaching going on here. Yeah. And that's what this letter is trying to address, is correcting this false doctrine. Is that right?
That's right.
All right.
So our context has helped us a little bit in identifying history. There's a lot of other fun verses that are around our specific verses that we could spend hours discussing. It talks about women being saved by childbirth, or women needing to remain silent. And those are some fun verses we could podcast. But for today's purposes, I just want to anchor ourselves in just 1 Timothy 2, 9 and 10, just because we need to stay focused today.
Yes, and I might question your definition of fun.
Oh, yeah. Fair. Fair.
All right, but those are big, heavy passages as well. We would have to spend a lot of time on those. All right, so fair. Let's stick with this one here.
All right, and shout out to our podcast. We actually have done a podcast on 1 Corinthians 14:34, which is the women remain silent.
Yeah.
So it might give you a little insight if you want to have some fun and study some of those fun verses. I think they are. All right, so let's dive into our history questions. We typically, if we actually look at our context, we've already answered two of them. We've answered the who, and we've answered the where the narrative is taking place. Who is it written to? Where was the narrative taking place? But let's dive deeper into both, because our first question in history, whoa, I just lost my iPad. The first question in history is, who is it written to, who is it written about, and how would the Bible describe them? And what we see is in 1 Timothy 2, we've already identified that it's Timothy, the true son of faith. And my cross-references pointed me to Acts 16, where we see that Timothy is the son of a Greek father and a Jewish mother, so he's in a mixed faith home, and yet he probably understood the Greek culture. We also see in 2 Timothy, if we keep on reading into these Paul letters, that Timothy was influenced by his grandmother and his mother, Lois and Eunice. That's actually how he came to faith in Jesus. And Paul's commending those women for their service in helping train Timothy up. And so we have this young Timothy guy who Paul's obviously shepherding and is leading the church. And we see within these first verses, in our context we've already read, that it's being written to help support this church in Ephesus. That's who it's being written about. And we see, we've already uncovered some of this, how they're described, that there's obviously needing correction of issues that are happening in the Ephesus area. We already talked about false doctrine, but even in verses 6 and 7 of chapter 1, we see that they've departed from the way. The way is another way of saying the spread of the gospel of Jesus. So they departed from the way. They're turning aside fruitless discussion. They don't understand what they're saying. This description of these people in Ephesians it's not painting a really good picture.
No, it's not. It sounds like they've lost their way, or they've turned away from the truth. And I love that a minute ago that you pointed back to Acts for some history, because we really do. Acts is a historical book and tells like the story of the early church, and these letters are written and overlap that time period.
Oh, that's good.
Glad you mentioned that.
It's a good call out, because I think oftentimes we think of the Bible as chronological, but Acts overlaps most of the letters. And so you're going to get a good taste if you kind of reference both as you're reading. Okay, so we've done the who. We're going to switch to where. Where was the narrative taking place, and what can we learn about their town? Obviously, we've already said Ephesus. We see that in Timothy chapter 1, verse 3. There's two ways that you can learn about Ephesus and about a place in the Bible. Number one is you can read the Bible. You can look at an intro to the book of 1 Timothy or Ephesians. And honestly, it pointed me to Acts, specifically Acts 19. So we're going to camp there in a second. But the other thing we can do is look at historical resources that talk about that place and time. These are real places and real, cities that have history around them. And so I actually went to some history books and looked at what can I learn about Ephesus and what was it like? And this is what I learned. And this is from different resources that were quite vetted, ones that I know have authenticity in understanding history. So I wasn't on Bob's historical website. Poor Bob. I keep every podcast. So it's Ephesians, or Ephesus, was the capital in a Rome province in Asia. It was a significant trade center. And so we know this because it was located at a mouth of a river, but it also had a lot of major roads that connected it to different places in the Asia Minor. And it's most noted and famous for having the Temple of Artemis, or Diana, which is was one of the designated 7 wonders of the world. It's really quite interesting. Artemis was a fertility goddess. And was known for supposedly having the power to help women through childbearing and childbirth. And so a lot of, if you actually see the statue of her, it looks like it has eggs all over it. So it very much is embodying her fertility side of what she was known for. And the craftsmen in that area would sell shrines and images of the goddess to worshipers, that they would take them on their journeys as they're passing through this town. So this is all just from history books. This is not necessarily from the Bible, but get this. We see that Paul's actually interacted here in Acts 19. We see that his second missionary journey brought him to Ephesus for a couple of years. So he hung out there. And Acts 19 gives us the reason why. It actually quotes Acts 19:10 says, all the Jews and Greeks who lived in the province of Asia would hear the word of the Lord. That's why he wanted to be there. He wanted everybody to hear about the word of the Lord.
Well, and it makes sense as you were talking about with where it was located, and it was on this trade route, right? Like, and there's a lot, and also if you imagine, there's a lot of people coming and going from here, right? Which coming with their own doctrine as well, right? Like, and as well as Artemis and what was going on here, you can just imagine like this melting pot of beliefs and things that are going on here. So it makes sense why Paul would be writing this letter to instruct Timothy to stay grounded in the word and to identify false teaching.
Well, and on top of it, Paul knew this place well.
He did.
So he understood what Timothy was up against as being a pastor of this church or a leader of the church. All right, so we know the who, we know the where. Let's go to when. When was this event taking place? What was happening in history at the time? If you look at most study Bibles, at the beginning of a book, it will tell you the date of when they estimate that the book was written. We can tell that the book was written around 62 to 65 AD because it was likely written after Acts 28, just from a timing perspective. And it was 88-ish years after Paul was in Ephesus. And so that dates it around that 62 to 65. Some resources said 63 to 66, but we get the idea, right? It's in the 60s, not our 60s, their 60s, 60 AD, which I think is an important thing for us to note when we're studying it for this specific verse.
Right. And, I don't know that that's something that I've always paid much attention to. When was a book written or when were the events that are being talked about? When did they happen? But it really does help you because then you can look at those resources you were talking about because these are real places in history. We can go back and we can figure out what was going on. And it really helps us understand why this letter was written.
Yeah. And when we know the timing, we are going back to these history. And that's a lot of what I did. I was researching and understanding what was happening in Ephesus at that time period because maybe 100, 200, 300 years later, it would have been a different story. What was happening at that time would influence us. Now, the fortunate thing is, yes, we can go and figure out what's happening in history at that time by looking at historical resources, but we have the benefit of reading Acts 19, which gives us a pretty clear look at a couple years prior to this, what was happening in Ephesus. And so if we read Acts 19, which our Bible intros to our study Bibles have pointed us to, here's what it talks about. It says that there was a major disturbance about the way, right? We've already kind of heard this loud and clear, even for Timothy's instructions. The local people were concerned because the teachings of Paul that he was doing, they were getting the local people concerned because the temple of the great Artemis was losing her influence. Yeah. And Artemis, as magnificent as a goddess, would be robbed of her great prestige. This is literally quoting Acts, you guys. These people were truly concerned. And the craftsmen had an uproar because these images that they would create for these worshipers, their business was starting to get disturbed because people were turning to God instead of to Artemis.
Yeah, we don't need these little idols anymore.
No, we don't need them.
They were losing money.
They were. And so they all start shouting at the end of Acts. They all start shouting in unison for 2 hours. They shout, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Can you imagine? 2 hours. They were mad. They were mad about what Paul was doing in Ephesus because it was disrupting their business. It was disrupting their culture. And yet at the same time, they obviously...
And their God, right?
Their God. Yeah. It was a big deal. Okay, so this leads us to one of my favorite questions in history, which is what worldview, cultural, religious, political factors and experience were a part of their world. We've already been uncovering some of that. Yeah. We really have.
And from the biblical text.
Completely.
Which is cool.
Yeah. Well, anytime, that's a great point though, Sarah, because I think oftentimes we think history, we always have to go to history books. A lot of time history is found just within the biblical text too. But there were 2 things that I did get from the culture that were outside of the biblical text. 2 cultural aspects that were a part of Ephesus that I got from commentaries and from study Bibles. And I'm calling these out because I think they're helpful in interpreting our verse about the modesty of elaborate jewelry and hair and all that fun stuff. Number 1, upper class women showcase their wealth by, guess what? Braiding their hair elaborately and wearing expensive jewelry and clothing. So given our verse is talking about that same thing, it's worth noting who is often found doing this. It's the financial wealthy. And so that's something to keep in mind as we're interpreting this verse. The second we've already started to uncover was Paul was writing to this culture that was influenced by this Artemis of Ephesians. And there's 3 things more I want you to know about Artemis that I have not uncovered until this point. Number 1, the temple of Artemis was run by female officials, and they taught that women were created first.
Now that really is interesting. And actually it kind of makes you, because if you keep reading here, one of the fun verses Heather mentioned earlier, I think was at 2:13, for Adam was formed first, then Eve. I wonder if, and I'm suspicious that, what you just said about that, how they viewed women and women were created first, I imagine that Paul's addressing that there.
That's exactly right. This happens a lot. Once you understand a little bit about Artemis and the fact that she's part of that she cared about childbearing, and that she had these women that they were teaching that women were created first. Go read First Timothy again, and you'll start to see some of the influences that are popping out of things that Paul's addressing. And honestly, I think that Paul's probably trying to undercut and correct some of these false teachings that were happening in this area. Number two thing we learn about Artemis is that the temple priestesses and the cult leaders that were at the temple appeared to have been virgin girls, sexually inactive wives, and widows, and so they were known. Some of the resources said prostitutes, but a majority of them talked about them being virgins. And if that's the case, that brings an interesting light about maybe what Paul was also addressing within Timothy.
Right, because if you read all of First Timothy, you'd find later on, about in chapters 4 and 5, that Paul's addressing there's a false teaching that was forbidding people to marry, so he addresses that. But he also spends some time giving some instruction to young women and to widows.
Well, yeah, because you can imagine if people walked away from Artemis that were part of the temple priestesses, they would have been widows, they would have been young women, and they would have needed help and support.
Right.
So he's teaching to the culture. All right, the last and probably the most important point that I learned in looking at cultural aspects in history was that the elaborate styles that we are hearing in our own verses were often associated with the temple priestesses. That's what they wore. Was these jewelry, and they looked really good, and that's. So not only were the upper class wealthy people wearing these elaborate hairstyles and jewelry, we're also seeing it directly in the culture and of the goddess of Artemis. So I mean that, which then makes you ask the question, how? How would the original audience have heard this message? If we know that the upper class women were the ones wearing these hairstyles and elaborate jewelry, and we also know that Artemis's temple priestesses were as well, what does that make us think the original audience would have heard this verse? Let's read the verse again. It's 1 Timothy 2:9-10 says, women are to dress themselves in modest clothing with decency and good sense, not with elaborate hairstyles, gold, pearls, or expensive apparel, but with good works, as a proper for women who profess to worship God. So, if upper class women showcase their wealth this way, this verse, the way the original audience would have heard it, it's basically them saying they're calling them to downplay their financial status with their clothing.
Which I think is really fascinating, because when I've read this passage before, and I think even heard teachings on this passage before, I think there's an assumption that we bring that it's talking about sexual modesty, to dress modest, in the way you cover up, that kind of thing. Yeah. But what I'm hearing you say, that this verse is perhaps more about financial modesty. And so we sometimes bring those assumptions into the biblical text just because maybe that's something that our culture, values more. But so it is helpful to, through that lens, that we should be thinking of this as financial modesty, even though, sexual modesty is important too, but this passage is probably more talking about financial.
That's exactly it. I think we might be able to get the sexual modesty commentary from another verse. It's not coming necessarily from this one.
Sure.
So if we go back to our cultural things we've learned, if the Temple of Artemis was a major influence on how people dressed, then as you go to interpret this passage and we ask the question, how would our original audience have heard it? What we're hearing is then the interpretation is, set yourself apart. Be careful of letting this pagan culture or the world around you set your standard of fashion. In fact, based on both interpretations, the line after in verse 10 makes sense, since it's less of a focus on what not to do. And you see verse 10, chapter 2, verse 10, focus more on what you should do. Adorn yourself with good deeds appropriate for women who profess to worship. It's like Paul's directing them to help them understand that godliness is way more beautiful than external decoration, and that we should stress more inward adornment rather than the outward appearance.
Oh, I love that.
Right?
I think that verse gets overlooked a lot.
Well, yeah, and there's an ability, their ability to be attractive should not be relying on what they're wearing, how they look, their wealth. None of that is what God is caring about, but instead it should be tied to the service of Christ, and that's what's being attractive to others is their service to Christ, their love for Christ.
I know we're not to apply yet, but boy, there's some application there,
Right?
isn't there, for today?
Right.
Yeah.
That completely. You're getting see what happens when you start to build on some of these questions that we ask. All right, so we want to ask the question, why, from our history section of why was this message given to these people? Well, I think the answer feels a little obvious.
Yeah.
Like we've already unpacked a lot of what was happening within the culture. They were steeped in a culture of false doctrine, and people were turning away. And what Paul was teaching was kind of falling flat because they were getting influenced by the world around them. And they needed reminding that God cares about not what is happening on the outward appearance, but more what's happening inside the heart. And that wasn't what they were valuing. And so I love that we can understand the why pretty fast because we already kind of really uncovered it just by asking some of the other history questions.
So did we get through all the history questions?
We did.
We just did. And isn't it helpful, I think, to answer all of those history questions to help us know what was going on in the culture? We definitely find out what was plaguing the Ephesian culture that, at that time. That really helps.
Yeah,
the culture.
I think so too. And so now the question is, does our interpretation, what we're starting to see come through, does it apply across the Bible? Does it hold true across the Bible? This is one of our context questions.
Good question.
I always like to bounce it up against there because I want to know whether or not something is being shouted or whispered, right? And this is going to be an area where we're going to start to see it. Almost every one of the Bibles I opened up, and I opened up a few because I own a few and I love them all. All the different study Bibles I had all pointed me to a cross-reference in 1 Peter 3:3 and 4. And this is what it says. Do not let your adorning be external, the braiding of hair and the putting on of gold jewelry or the clothing you wear, but let your adorning be the hidden person of the heart with the imperishable beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which in God's sight is very precious.
Okay, so I love that Peter is referencing this too, because First Peter, that was written to the churches, again, in Asia Minor, which is where Ephesus was located. So you can tell that this is probably something, this topic is a little even more widespread than just Ephesus.
That's exactly right. And my guess is Artemis had a widespread fame as well, whether or not that necessarily plagued all of Asia Minor. It obviously, this concept of dressing well and the outward appearance obviously seemed to be plaguing a lot.
Well, and when you see Peter and Paul address it too, it's like, okay, all right, this was an issue.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
The other cross reference I got pointed to was in Proverbs 31:3. We see this idea that God cares more about the heart than the outward appearance. Proverbs 31:30 says, "Charm is deceptive and beauty is fleeting, but the woman who fears the Lord is to be praised."
Yeah, that's a really beautiful verse. So I'm curious. I mean, I think we know the answer, but I don't think that this passage is necessarily saying that we can't wear makeup today or we can't wear jewelry today, right? Or that we should make ourselves intentionally look unattractive. I mean, we have our days, right?
Yeah.
I'm not going to try, but I don't think that this verse is necessarily saying that. But so maybe it's kind of redefining too what beauty is. Is it the world's definition of beauty, or are we talking about God's definition of beauty here?
Which I love that. I want to hang on to that because I think that's what's going to help us as we go to apply this, because I think oftentimes we want to look at what the world says for beauty, and that's not necessarily the case. I'm not going to we've used a lot of resources today in history to be able to do this, but if we were to go to the research section of our CHARA guide and it asks us the question of what biblical scholars are saying about this, I encourage you to when you're studying a passage like this, to make sure you're getting out other resources that help kind of guide you and see where you're seeing a majority of people that are saying something similar about a topic like this. I actually had to go and look at a lot of different commentaries to make sure that what am I seeing? Is it mapped across multiple different, is it the same thing across multiple different commentaries, or is this one random person out here saying something different? But it reminds me of our key principle of vetting your resources. When you go to research, you need to make sure that everything you're doing is looking at resources that are going to help you and not hurt you, because they need to be vetted accordingly. I was just talking to a friend the other day who said that they were looking something up online and they realized something felt off to them. And then they went to the About section and realized that this wasn't a historically accurate or a very accurate website. And she was thankful that she had gone to the About section to double check her resource before she was just like, I'm going to use this as gold. So it's just, there's my little warning as you go to vet your resources. Make sure that you're looking at that About section. It will help you know whether or not it's a legit website you should be following.
That's really great advice. And as you and I were talking about actually just earlier, we were talking about how a good study Bible or even just biblical scholars will often give you if there are multiple interpretations to a verse, they often will give you all of those. And I know you mentioned that your NIV study Bible does that. So does mine, the CSB, the Christian Standard Bible, will often give you kind of, like they won't just tell you, they'll give you the option, or not the options, but they'll tell you what the different interpretations are. And then they often will say, most likely it's this because of this reason.
That's exactly right. And so it's really helpful for you to be able to see exactly where it's going. So let's apply.
All right.
Let's go apply. We've done all of our history deep dive. We literally have hit every single CHARA in our CHARA Bible Study Guide. One of the questions you had at the top of this, Sarah, was, is this a cultural or is it a timeless truth?
Yeah.
And reminder, cultural truth, is it meant for the people, for those people back then in that time period, not for us today? Or is it timeless, meaning that it transcends time and it's applicable to us today? And this can be one of the hardest things to determine as you're studying the Bible.
Yeah, how do we do that, Heather?
Yeah, and so there's two different things that I want to leave you with. The first question you should ask is, you should determine why it might be for a specific culture. We've already done this today. We asked who was the audience, we asked what was going on in their culture, and we tried to kind of unwrap, is it something that could be culturally happening at that time? Okay. And so that's number one. Determine the why it may be for a specific culture. And the second is this concept repeated throughout the Bible? So, those are at least the two questions that I want us to uncover. Ultimately, here's the deal. The Bible can't mean now what it didn't mean back then.
Right. Yeah. And that is one of our key principles, right? So we have to unlock the original meaning before we can understand it today. And in order to do that, we have to hear it the way they heard it. We have to go back into history. So I love that you camped there today.
Yes, exactly. So we've camped in the history. We understand why it was specific. Is the concept repeated throughout the Bible? Here's the deal. If it's whispered throughout the Bible, it's cultural. It's probably cultural. If it's a yes, if it's shouted throughout the Bible, it's likely timeless. So let's apply that to this verse that we just studied today about the elaborate hairstyles and jewelry. Timeless truths that we can pull out of this, that were shouted across the Bible, is that God looks at the heart more than our outward appearance. Another thing that was shouted is that God expects us to not conform to the world's standards. He has his own standards for us, and it's not something that the world's going to define for us. That's shouted loud and clear, not only in our passage, but throughout the Bible. Now, what's not shouted is the elaborate hairstyle and jewelry. Yes, we see it in 1 Peter and in Timothy, but here's the thing. It was tied to the culture of that day, what was going on in that time. They were adorning themselves, and it had a specific meaning or significance to the culture of its time. I'm guessing if they were to write this letter today, they'd be addressing different things about, whether or not it's how we carry our phones around all the time, or, whatever it is that becomes the distraction for us that doesn't allow us to align ourselves with God. I think they'd be addressing different things with us today.
Possibly, although this is still applicable today. I mean, the idea that we can flaunt our wealth when we go to church.
Fair.
I mean, James talks about that too. They were favoring the rich and giving them the priority in their seating and not taking care of the poor. And so that still is something I think that we got to be careful about today in our church. And that might depend on where you live. It could be more of a cultural thing in some places.
Totally. But that's exactly it. A cultural truth has to be, one of the things we have to remember about the Bible is that the Bible has to transcend cultures. So our application of what we're pulling out of it has to be able to transcend cultures and times and places. And so with this type of interpretation, we may value the wealth and the whatever. There may be others that are going to value something different in a different culture today. And so that's where we just have to be careful that we say, oh, nope, it's no jewelry, no elaborate hairstyles, none at all, because that's not necessarily what it was getting at. It was the story behind the jewelry. It was the story behind their purpose. What was their heart? Their heart was to show off. That's what he cares more about, is the showing off, than it is about the actual jewelry itself.
If I remember correctly, when we first talked about doing this verse, we were actually going to do our hair very elaborately.
We really were. Shoot, we totally missed out. I actually did straighten my hair today. Most people don't realize that I actually have naturally curly hair, and I don't show it on camera very often. Maybe next
my
video.
husband, elaborate hair would be big hair.
Oh, nice.
So
80s hair. I love it.
Did not do that.
Next time, Sarah.
All right.
All right. So one of the other apply questions we may want to ask is, what do we learn about God, his character, his attributes, his desires? I think we're getting a good idea of what his heart cares about here.
I love that question.
Yeah. I mean, because he's caring more about our hearts. Yeah. Again, it's not that he doesn't want us to wear jewelry. It's not that he does want us to wear jewelry. He cares more about our attitude toward it and what's our purpose behind it.
Well, and I think we end up finding pride in those things. Like anywhere where we're finding pride, whether it's in our wealth or our looks or whatever it might be, I think there's a gut check there.
Yeah.
Right. Like, okay, I'm probably off.
That's right. Well, and that goes to our last question that I want to talk about is pray and ask the Lord, what do you want me to learn and how do you want me to apply this to my life? There's a gut check here. There's a heart check here actually of, am I wearing things for the right reason? Am I presenting myself because of the fashions of the world, or am I presenting myself more about do I care more about my heart? I have this conversation with my daughter. We're at an age right now where modesty and we're talking a lot about what you wear and the choices that you have in your wardrobe. And we're having the heart conversations is where they have to go, because that's what this verse is teaching us. That it's, why are you wearing it? What's your purpose in wearing it? What are you trying to convey by wearing it? That becomes the conversation in our home, because it is a heart thing more than it is what you're actually wearing.
Right. And I love too, I mean, that we should look and act differently. We should be set apart.
Yeah.
Right. Like the culture shouldn't necessarily define how we present ourselves.
Yeah.
We should present ourselves as Christians.
That's right.
And so this is a great one to apply.
It is. It's a fun one, because as much as it was a cultural truth-ish, there are always timeless truths that you can pull out of a Bible passage, even if it is more bent toward that culture. And we get to see and understand the character of God in this verse. So as we go to, if you were to study this with a group, you guys, if this is ever a verse that you're like, hey, let's pick this one off the shelf and study it together. One of the things, there's 2 tips I want to give you. Number 1, make sure that you ask the people around your group their perception of this verse, because my guess is that they've come in with different cultural assumptions or things that they've heard in whether it's their own church building or in family members or friends of how this verse has been interpreted in their life. That's number 1. And number 2, make sure you are spending a lot of time in history, because the history is really going to bring this passage to life and help you understand what was happening to be able to interpret it.
Well, but could be fun in a group setting, and we've done this before in group settings where, all of our study Bibles are typically different. And so maybe take turns, go around the room and read, hey, what do you learn from your notes or your intro to the passage? And that can be really fun to kind of share those. Now, if you do want to study this verse or any of the verses that we do here with the CHARA in action, we have created a Bible study guide that you can download. It's just on this passage. It's perfect for really one evening or one gathering together. We've done these quite a bit with different groups.
We have.
But you can find it on our website. And so, take advantage of that. It could be a fun one to study. So, Heather, thank you for applying this, and thank you for walking us through this verse that can be a little bit confusing and maybe one we don't love that much at first, because we want our jewelry and our.
I know. I was like, should I wear more jewelry today or less?
Our elaborate hairstyles. So thanks for walking us through this. You can visit our website to find more resources, and even we talked a lot about actually resources today. Some of the ones that we recommend, you can go to our website for those. Please make sure you subscribe, like, and comment at the CHARA Project. That really helps us out. And we look forward to having you join us next time when we pick another fun verse in the Bible to study.